Somewhere around 1792 before Christ, a young man stepped onto the throne of a city that no empire feared. Babylon was not yet the wonder of the ancient world. It was a modest settlement of mud-brick walls and narrow canals, hemmed in by kingdoms older, richer, and far more powerful. The prince who inherited it was called Hammurabi, and within 4 decades he would forge the most famous legal monument in human history, conquer nearly every rival who surrounded him, and then watch the cracks spread through the empire he had built with his own hands. How did a king from a second-tier city become the lawgiver whose words were still being copied by scribes 1,000 years after his death? This is his complete story, not a summary, not a collection of famous moments carved from context. This is the full arc of a life, told from the world that shaped him to the legacy that outlived every dynasty that followed. You will witness the Amorite migrations that planted his family in southern Mesopotamia, the modest reigns of 5 kings who came before him, and the fragile inheritance his father Sin-Muballit placed into his hands. You will follow the young king through nearly 2 decades of patience, digging canals, raising temple walls, forging alliances through clay letters carried across the desert by exhausted messengers. You will read over his shoulder as he dictates correspondence preserved in the archives of Mari, letters revealing a ruler who personally adjudicated irrigation disputes and tracked the movements of distant armies. Then you will stand at the turning point, the 29th year of his reign, when patience gave way to war and Hammurabi unleashed a series of campaigns that shattered Elam, toppled the aged king Rim-Sin of Larsa, and ended with the burning of Mari, the ally he once called brother. You will see the empire at its zenith, stretching from the marshes of the Persian Gulf to the upper Euphrates. And you will watch it begin to fracture even before the king drew his last breath. At the heart of this story stands a slab of polished black diorite, 282 laws carved beneath the image of a king standing before Shamash, god of justice. That stele was not the first law code in Mesopotamian history, but it became the most enduring. It traveled through centuries of scribal tradition, survived conquest by Elamite armies who carried it as war plunder to Susa, and lay buried in the earth for nearly 3,000 years until French archaeologists pulled it from the ground at the dawn of the 20th century. Today it stands in the Louvre, and the questions it raises about justice, power, and the written word still resonate. What makes Hammurabi extraordinary is not simply conquest. Conquerors are common. It is the paradox of a man who built an empire held together almost entirely by his personal will, yet whose lasting gift to civilization was the idea that law should be visible, public, carved in stone for any literate person to read. He was a micromanager who tracked stolen livestock and a visionary who reshaped the theology of an entire civilization around the god Marduk. He was a diplomat who could maintain alliances for decades and a strategist cold enough to destroy his closest ally when the moment demanded it. Without him, the very concept of written legal authority might have evolved along an entirely different path. If you find yourself drawn to complete journeys through the lives that shaped the ancient world, subscribe and stay close. Each journey here follows one extraordinary life, from its first breath to its immortal name, separating evidence from legend, revealing the human being behind the myth. Now let us begin where every empire begins, long before the crown, in the dust and ambition of a small city on the banks of the Euphrates, where a dynasty no one yet remembered was just learning how to survive. The river bends south through a land without stone. For 1,000 miles in every direction, there is nothing but alluvial clay, silt carried down from distant mountains and deposited across a plain so flat that the horizon dissolves into heat shimmer. This is Lower Mesopotamia in the 19th century before the Common Era, a world built entirely from what the Euphrates and Tigris leave behind. Cities rise here not from quarried rock, but from mud pressed into bricks and dried under a white sun. Temples climb toward the sky on platforms of packed earth and bitumen. Reed boats slide through canals cut by human hands into the soft ground. Date palms line the waterways in dense groves, and beyond them, the irrigated fields of barley stretch to the edge of the desert. Into this ancient landscape of Sumerian cities, Uruk, Nippur, Eridu, a new people have been arriving for generations. They come from the west, from the arid steppe between the Euphrates and the Mediterranean. The Akkadian scribes call them Amuru, Amorites. Semi-nomadic herders of sheep and goats, speakers of a West Semitic tongue, they filter into the settled world not as a single invasion, but as a slow, persistent migration across decades. Some serve as soldiers, some tend flocks on the margins of irrigated land, some rise to positions of authority within crumbling city-state administrations. By the 20th century before the Common Era, Amorite chieftains have begun seizing thrones across Mesopotamia, founding new dynasties in ancient cities. Around 1894 before the Common Era, one such man establishes himself at Babylon. His name is Zumuabum. The city he claims is modest, a minor settlement on the Euphrates, overshadowed by the great centers of Sumerian civilization to the south and the powerful kingdom of Eshnunna to the northeast. Its walls are low. Its temple to the god Marduk is provincial. No king list yet celebrates its rulers. But Zumuabum builds. He raises fortifications. He digs canals. He carves out a small territory along the river and defends it. 5 kings follow him across the next 80 years. Zumulael expands the walls and extends Babylonian control over neighboring towns. Sabium and Apil-Sin consolidate, dedicating temples and managing the irrigation networks that sustain life on the plain. Sin-Muballit, the 5th successor, inherits a kingdom still hemmed in by far greater powers. To the south, the city of Larsa dominates under its long-lived king Rim-Sin, who has conquered Isin and claims supremacy over all of Sumer. To the northeast, Eshnunna controls the Diyala River Valley and the trade routes to the Iranian plateau. To the northwest, the city of Mari commands the middle Euphrates, its palace a wonder of painted walls and diplomatic archives. And beyond the Zagros Mountains, the old kingdom of Elam watches and waits. Sin-Muballit fights. He campaigns against Larsa and suffers setbacks. He struggles to hold what his ancestors built. The year names of his reign, the Babylonian method of marking time by each year's most notable achievement, record wall construction, canal digging, military expeditions of mixed success. Babylon under his rule remains what it has been for nearly a century, a survivor, not a conqueror. A city of ambition pressed into clay, its dynasty Amorite in blood, but increasingly Mesopotamian in culture, its scribes writing in Akkadian cuneiform, its priests serving gods whose names stretch back to the Sumerians. The mud-brick walls of this small kingdom catch the last light of evening. Smoke rises from temple offerings. Somewhere in the royal household, a son is growing. learning the wedge-shaped script, absorbing the rhythms of diplomacy and threat that define life between the rivers. The world he will inherit is fragmented, dangerous, and ancient. No one standing on those modest walls around 1813 before the Common Era could imagine what this city will become, or that the boy within it will reshape the political order of an entire civilization. But the foundations are already laid, in mud, in patience, and in the quiet accumulation of 5 generations of Amorite kings who refused to let Babylon fall. Sin-Muballit sits on the throne of Babylon in a world that offers him no peace. The 6th king of the Amorite dynasty, he inherits a kingdom that has survived through caution, but caution alone will not hold back the pressures closing in from every direction. To the south, Rim-Sin I of Larsa has been conquering city after city for decades, absorbing Isin, extending his reach northward with the patience of a man who has ruled longer than most men live. To the northeast, Eshnunna commands the trade routes descending from the Iranian plateau, and beyond the Zagros mountains, the power of Elam watches, intervenes, withdraws, and watches again. Into this world, around 1810 before the Common Era, a son is born in the royal household of Babylon. The clay tablets do not record the exact date. No birth announcement survives. What survives is the name, Hammurabi, an Amorite name meaning, in the most widely accepted reading, the kinsman is a healer. It is a name rooted in the tribal traditions his dynasty still carries, even as they govern a city whose culture is thoroughly Sumerian and Akkadian in its institutions. The boy grows up inside mud-brick palace walls where lamplight flickers across shelves of cuneiform tablets. His education follows the path expected of an old Babylonian prince. He learns to read and write Akkadian in the cuneiform script, pressing a reed stylus into wet clay, forming the wedge-shaped signs that record everything from grain inventories to hymns to the gods. He studies Sumerian, the classical language of scholarship and liturgy, already ancient and no longer spoken in the streets, but essential for any educated man. He learns mathematics, the sexagesimal system that divides circles into 360 degrees and hours into 60 minutes, a system his civilization will bequeath to every civilization that follows. But his education is not merely scribal. A prince of Babylon must understand canal management, the lifeblood of agriculture on the alluvial plain. He must understand military organization, the marshalling of infantry armed with bronze-tipped spears and axes. He must understand diplomacy, the careful exchange of letters, gifts, and threats that keeps a small kingdom alive among larger predators. Sin-Muballit himself provides the most urgent lessons. His reign is marked by military campaigns that achieve limited success and by construction projects that strengthen Babylon's defenses. Year names from his rule record the fortification of city walls and the digging of canals. But the great prize eludes him. He campaigns against Larsa and fails to break Rim-Sin's grip on the south. The old king of Larsa endures, immovable, his power growing while Babylon strains. The circumstances of Sin-Muballit's departure from the throne remain unclear. Some scholars suggest he abdicated due to illness or military failure. Others propose a natural death. What the evidence confirms is that around 1792 before the Common Era, Hammurabi ascends to kingship. He is likely in his late teens or early 20s, young, but not unusually so by the standards of Mesopotamian succession. The new king's earliest year names reveal his priorities with crystalline clarity. He establishes justice in the land, a traditional royal act, likely involving the cancellation of certain debts and the freeing of debt slaves, a reset designed to secure loyalty and social stability. He dedicates thrones to the gods Nana and Shamash. He attends to the temples, because in Mesopotamia kingship is inseparable from divine service. The king is the shepherd chosen by the gods, and his legitimacy flows from their favor. There is no record of grand ambition in these first pronouncements, no declaration of conquest. The young king who takes the throne of Babylon around 1792 before the Common Era presents himself as a builder, a servant of the gods, a guardian of justice. The world beyond his walls is dominated by kings who are older, richer, and more powerful. Rim-Sin has ruled Larsa for over 30 years already. Zimri-Lim holds the splendid palace of Mari on the middle Euphrates. Dadusha commands Eshnunna. Hammurabi begins where his fathers began, with patience, with mud brick, with the careful tending of canals and alliances. The reed stylus is in his hand. The clay is wet, and the young king writes his first year into the record of a dynasty that has survived for a century by knowing when to wait. The canals come first. In his second year on the throne, the year name that Hammurabi's scribes assign to the record speaks of digging a waterway called Hammurabi is the abundance of the people. It is not a poetic flourish. It is an engineering project measured in thousands of labor hours, in baskets of earth hauled from the channel bed, in the careful gradient calculations that allow water to flow from the Euphrates into fields that would otherwise bake to powder under the summer sun. The young king understands what every ruler of southern Mesopotamia has always understood, that civilization here is irrigation, and irrigation is power. Year after year the pattern holds. His third year records the construction of a throne for the goddess Inanna. His fourth, the building of a city wall. His fifth, another wall, another fortification. The year names read like an accountant's ledger of piety and infrastructure. A canal here, a temple dedication there, the raising of defensive works around settlements that sit exposed on the flat plain. There is no mention of battle. No enemy king defeated, no city sacked. For nearly 2 decades, the records of Hammurabi's reign describe a king who builds. The mud brick rises in courses along Babylon's perimeter. Workers mix clay with chopped straw, press it into wooden molds, and leave the bricks to cure in the relentless heat. Bitumen, black and viscous, is heated in pots and spread between courses as mortar and waterproofing. The walls grow thicker, taller. Gates are reinforced with baked brick, harder and more expensive than the sun-dried variety, reserved for surfaces that must resist rain and siege alike. Babylon in these years is a construction site, the sound of tamping, the smell of hot pitch, the endless procession of laborers carrying loads on their backs. Temple dedications punctuate the building seasons. Hammurabi raises shrines, restores sanctuaries, commissions cult statues. Each dedication binds the priesthood closer to the throne, secures divine favor in the eyes of the populace, and announces to neighboring kings that Babylon's gods are well served and therefore powerful. The temple economy is no small matter. These institutions control vast agricultural lands, employ hundreds of dependents, and function as banks, granaries, and centers of scribal learning. A king who builds temples builds loyalty. Beyond the walls, diplomacy moves at the speed of a donkey caravan. Envoys travel between courts carrying clay tablets sealed in clay envelopes, letters of greeting, proposals of alliance, requests for troops or trade goods. Hammurabi maintains relations with Zimri-Lim of Mari to the northwest, exchanges courtesies with the kings of Eshnunna and Elam, and watches Rim-Sin of Larsa with the careful attention of a man who knows his most dangerous neighbor. The alliances shift like sand patterns in a canal current, but through these early decades Babylon remains at peace, not because the world is peaceful, but because its king has chosen patience as strategy. The fields beyond the city yield barley and dates. The canals fill and empty with the river's seasonal rhythm. Sheep graze the stubble after harvest. Trade boats pole along waterways connecting Babylon to the Persian Gulf, carrying wool, sesame oil, and finished textiles south, bringing copper and stone north. The kingdom is modest in territory but increasingly prosperous, its administration tightening under a king who, as later letters will reveal, involves himself in the smallest details of governance, the allocation of a field, the settlement of a boundary dispute, the proper maintenance of a canal bank. 17 years pass in this manner. 17 years of mud brick and barley, of temple offerings and diplomatic letters, of walls rising and canals deepening. To a chronicler seeking drama, these years might seem empty, but they are the foundation. Every canal dug is food stored against siege. Every wall raised is a season bought against invasion. Every alliance maintained is an army that will not march against Babylon when the time comes to march against others. The young king who inherited a vulnerable throne is becoming something else, a ruler with resources, with infrastructure, with a network of obligations and intelligence that stretches across the Mesopotamian plain. He is not yet a conqueror, but he is building the machine that will make conquest possible. The letters travel by foot and by donkey across hundreds of miles of flat steppe and river valley, sealed in clay envelopes that bear the impressions of cylinder seals. They move between palaces, from Babylon to Mari, from Mari to Babylon, from Eshnunna to both, from Elam to all. And within these small tablets, pressed with the wedge-shaped marks of Akkadian script, an entire world of calculation and suspicion breathes. The Mari archives preserve more than 20,000 tablets from the palace of Zimri-Lim, and among them are letters that mention Hammurabi by name, his requests, his promises, his evasions, his intelligence gathering. One official at Mari writes to his king that Hammurabi is a ruler who listens carefully, speaks little, and commits to nothing until the moment is perfect. Another reports that Babylonian agents move through the courts of rival kingdoms, gathering information about troop movements, grain stores, and the health of aging kings. The alliance between Babylon and Mari is the central axis of this period. Zimri-Lim rules a kingdom on the middle Euphrates, a crossroads of trade between Syria and southern Mesopotamia. His palace at Mari is vast, nearly 300 rooms arranged around courtyards, its walls painted with scenes of investiture and sacrifice, its archives staffed by scribes who record everything. Ambassadors from Babylon reside at Mari for extended periods. They attend banquets, observe military preparations, and send detailed reports home. The Babylonian envoy Ibal-Piel appears repeatedly in the correspondence, relaying Hammurabi's positions on joint military operations and requests for troops. The system is not bilateral, it is a web. Hammurabi corresponds simultaneously with Rim-Sin of Larsa, with the kings of Eshnunna, with lesser rulers along the Tigris. He makes promises of mutual defense. He requests contingents of soldiers for campaigns that may or may not materialize. He delays. A letter from a Mari official observes that no king moves without first asking what Hammurabi will do, and that Hammurabi himself waits to see what everyone else does first. This is not weakness. It is the diplomacy of a ruler who understands that in a world of roughly equal powers, the one who commits last holds the advantage. The messenger routes cross open desert between the Euphrates and the Tigris, vulnerable to bandits and rival patrols. Information travels slowly, days, sometimes weeks. A king who can gather intelligence faster, who can read the intentions behind the courtesies, who can keep his own plans opaque while drawing out the plans of others, holds an invisible advantage that no army can match. The painted walls of Mari show a world of ritual and order, the king receiving divine authority, palm trees flanking sacred pools, mythical creatures guarding thresholds. But behind those painted surfaces, the letters reveal anxiety. Zimri-Lim worries about Elamite expansion. He worries about Eshnunna's ambitions. He asks Hammurabi for reassurance, and Hammurabi provides it, carefully, conditionally, never quite fully. The warmth between them is real but calculated. They exchange gifts, fine garments, weapons, wine from the West. They share military intelligence about Elam, but each knows the other is also speaking to his rivals. By the mid-1760s, before the Common Era, the web is tightening. Elam under Siwe-Palar-Hupak has grown aggressive, projecting power onto the Mesopotamian plain, demanding submission from smaller states. The pressure forces choices. Alliances that were flexible must now become firm. Hammurabi, who has spent nearly 3 decades building canals and walls and gathering information through this patient network of clay tablet diplomacy, now possesses something none of his rivals fully appreciate. He knows their strengths, their weaknesses, their fears, and their commitments. He has read their letters. He has hosted their ambassadors. He has counted their soldiers through the eyes of his agents. The machine he built in mud and barley is now also a machine built in knowledge, and the moment to use it approaches. The moment arrives in Hammurabi's 30th year on the throne. Elam, under the leadership of Siwe-Palar-Hupak, has pushed too far. Elamite armies and their vassals have crossed the Tigris, occupying cities on the Mesopotamian plain, demanding grain and silver, installing garrisons in territories that Babylon considers within its sphere. The highland power treats the lowland kings as tributaries, and for years many of them have complied. But now the demands have become intolerable, the garrisons oppressive, and the moment has come when submission costs more than resistance. Hammurabi does not act alone. The decades of diplomacy, the careful exchanges of messengers and gifts, the intelligence gathered through his network of agents, all of it crystallizes into a coalition. The sources indicate that forces from several Mesopotamian states join the effort against Elam. Babylon provides the core army and, crucially, the coordination. Those bronze-tipped spears that Babylonian smiths have been forging, the mud-brick walls that have protected granaries full of barley, these are the material foundations of war. But the true weapon is timing. The flat alluvial plain offers no mountain passes to defend, no natural choke points. Armies move along canals and riverbanks, through date palm groves and across irrigation channels. The Elamite forces, extended far from their highland bases beyond the Zagros, depend on long supply lines stretching back across the Tigris and into the foothills. Hammurabi understands this vulnerability. His year name for this 30th regnal year records the defeat of the army of Elam, a terse statement carved into administrative tablets across his kingdom, the bureaucratic confirmation of a seismic shift. The campaign itself must be imagined through its consequences, for no detailed battle narrative survives. What the evidence shows is decisive. Elamite forces are expelled from the Mesopotamian plain. The garrisons withdraw. The vassal arrangements that Siwi-Pala-Kupak imposed collapse. Cities that had bent to Elamite pressure now look to Babylon as their liberator. The coalition victory transforms Hammurabi's reputation overnight. He is no longer merely the careful administrator of canals and temples, the patient builder who waited while others fought. He is now a war leader who broke the power of the most feared military force in the region. Dawn light falls on marshaled infantry returning along the Euphrates road. Dust rises from thousands of sandaled feet. Bronze axe heads and spear points catch the early sun. The soldiers carry back not only victory but plunder, Elamite equipment, perhaps prisoners for labor on the very canals Hammurabi has spent decades perfecting. In the temples of Babylon, priests offer sacrifices to Marduk and Shamash. The king has fulfilled his sacred duty as shepherd of his people, as the one who drives away the enemy. But Hammurabi sees further than celebration. The defeat of Elam has not merely removed a threat, it has created a vacuum. The states that Elam dominated or intimidated are now unprotected, their old patron humiliated and retreating behind the Zagros. Larsa to the south, ruled by the aged Rim-Sin I for over 60 years, had maintained its own relationship with Elamite power. Eshnunna to the northeast sits exposed. The entire balance of Mesopotamia has shifted in a single campaigning season, and the man who shifted it now commands the strongest army on the plain, backed by full granaries and a network of allies who owe him gratitude. The patient king has become the dangerous king. Every rival who watched him dig canals for 3 decades must now recalculate. The storm that broke over Elam will not stop at the Zagros foothills. It will turn south, toward the ancient walls of Larsa, toward the throne of a king who has ruled since before Hammurabi was born. The storm turns south. Within months of Elam's humiliation, Hammurabi moves against the oldest throne in Mesopotamia. Rim-Sin I has ruled Larsa for more than 60 years, longer than any king in living memory, longer than Hammurabi has been alive. He conquered Izin decades ago, unified much of the south, and styled himself king of Sumer and Akkad. But he is ancient now, his alliances shattered, his Elamite patrons driven beyond the mountains. The world he mastered no longer exists. Hammurabi's 31st year on the throne carries the weight of this campaign in its very name. The year name records victory over Larsa with the certainty of a thing already accomplished, already carved into the administrative memory of the state. But the reality on the ground is siege warfare in the flat southern plain, armies moving along canal banks, supply lines stretched through date palm groves, the slow encirclement of a city whose mud-brick walls have stood for centuries. Larsa sits amid some of the richest agricultural land in Mesopotamia. Its temple to Shamash, the Ababa, gleams with generations of royal patronage. Its granaries are deep. Its population is substantial. A siege here is not a raid. It is a sustained operation requiring logistics that only a king with full control of the northern canal network can maintain. Hammurabi's army must be fed from Babylonian stores carried south along waterways his engineers have spent decades perfecting. The canals he dug in his patient years now serve as military arteries. The details of the siege itself survive only in fragments: year names, administrative references, the silence where Rimsin's own records abruptly cease. What is clear is that the city falls. Rimsin is captured alive, an extraordinary fate for a king of his stature and age. The sources do not record his execution, and some scholars believe he may have died in captivity, though his ultimate fate remains uncertain. What matters to Hammurabi's scribes is the completeness of the victory. Larsa's territories, its tax revenues, its temple estates, its canal systems, all pass under Babylonian administration. The absorption is methodical. Hammurabi does not simply garrison the city and move on. He integrates Larsa's bureaucracy into his own expanding state apparatus. Officials receive new instructions. Tax records are reorganized. The Temple of Shamash continues to function. Hammurabi is too shrewd to alienate the priesthood of the sun god, whose divine authority he will later invoke on his own law stele. Southern cities that had answered to Rim-Sin now answer to Babylon. The grain surplus of the southern marshlands flows north. In a single campaigning season, Hammurabi has doubled his kingdom. He controls both banks of the Euphrates from Babylon to the sea. The trade routes from the Persian Gulf, copper, timber, precious stones carried in reed boats through the marshes, now terminate in his treasury. He commands the agricultural heartland that once made Sumer the wealthiest region on earth. The aged king of Larsa vanishes from history in chains or in silence, his 60-year reign ending not with a successor but with absorption. His city endures, its temples maintained, its people taxed by new masters. But the independent kingdom of Larsa, which had dominated southern Mesopotamia for generations, ceases to exist. In its place stands a province of an empire that did not exist 2 years before. An empire still growing, still hungry, its architect already looking north and west toward the painted palace of Mari, where his ally Zimri-Lim sits on a throne that grows less secure with every Babylonian victory. The alliance with Zimri-Lim had been the longest and most productive diplomatic relationship of Hammurabi's reign. For nearly 2 decades, letters had passed between Babylon and Mari, requests for troops, shared intelligence about Elamite movements, negotiations over trade routes, and tin shipments from the west. The Mari archives preserve a portrait of 2 kings who operated as genuine partners, their ambassadors resident in each other's courts, their scribes exchanging information with a frequency that suggests real trust. But trust between Mesopotamian kings has always been conditional, and the condition that sustained this alliance was mutual vulnerability. With Elam broken and Larsa absorbed, that condition no longer holds. The painted palace of Mari stands on the middle Euphrates, a sprawling complex of nearly 300 rooms spread across more than 6 acres. Its walls bear frescoes unlike anything else in Mesopotamia, scenes of investiture, of sacrifice, of mythological gardens with stylized palm trees and flowing waters rendered in blues and reds and ochres that glow in lamplight. Courtyards open onto archive rooms where thousands of clay tablets document decades of royal correspondence, administrative records, census data, and diplomatic dispatches. This is one of the great administrative centers of the ancient world, and Hammurabi knows its layout intimately from the reports of his own ambassadors who have walked its corridors for years. In his 32nd year on the throne, around 1761 before the Common Era, Hammurabi moves against Mari. The precise provocation is debated. Later year names speak of the destruction of Mari's walls, but the diplomatic rupture that preceded it leaves fewer traces. What the evidence suggests is strategic logic rather than grievance. Mari controls the upper Euphrates trade routes, the flow of tin and timber from Anatolia and the Levant, and the pastoral territories of the Amorite tribes from which both dynasties originally descend. An independent Mari at his back, allied with kingdoms beyond his reach, represents a permanent strategic vulnerability that Hammurabi is no longer willing to tolerate. The first campaign subdues the city. Zimri Lim's fate remains one of the great silences of Mesopotamian history. Whether he died in battle, was captured, or fled into exile, no surviving text confirms. His name simply ceases to appear in the record. Hammurabi installs Babylonian authority over the city, but Mari proves restive. 2 years later, in his 35th regnal year, around 1759, Hammurabi returns. This time there is no occupation. The year name records the destruction of Mari's walls and the walls of a second city, Malgium. The great mud-brick fortifications are systematically dismantled, the palace left open to wind and sand. The burning of Mari's palace preserves what it destroys. The fire that sweeps through the archive rooms bakes the clay tablets hard, fixing them for millennia. The frescoes blacken and crack, but survive beneath collapsed debris. The administrative records of an entire kingdom, letters from kings, inventories of grain and livestock, lists of musicians and weavers and perfume makers, are sealed in destruction layers that archaeologists would uncover beginning in 1933 of the Common Era, under André Parrot's excavations. The silence after Mari's fall is the silence of completed conquest. From the Persian Gulf marshes to the bend of the Euphrates, no independent power of consequence remains to challenge Babylon. The trade routes that once enriched Zimri Lim now feed Hammurabi's treasury. The intelligence networks that once served the alliance now serve the empire alone. The king who spent his first 3 decades building canals and writing careful diplomatic letters has, in the span of 6 years, remade the political map of Mesopotamia through force. The patient architect has become the conqueror, and the conqueror now faces the harder question that every empire builder eventually confronts: whether what was taken by one man's will can be held by anything less. The empire, at its widest reach, stretches across a world defined by water. From the marshlands where the Tigris and Euphrates dissolve into brackish lagoons near the Persian Gulf, northward along both river valleys, through the heartland of ancient Sumer and Akkad, westward along the Euphrates to the ruins of Mari, and beyond toward the edges of the Syrian steppe, this is the domain that Hammurabi now governs. No single ruler has held this much of Mesopotamia since the kings of the 3rd dynasty of Ur collapsed nearly 3 centuries earlier. The year names of his final decade no longer record the digging of canals or the dedication of temple statues. They record the administration of an empire. Babylon itself is transforming. The modest city that Hammurabi inherited, a mud-brick settlement pressed against the eastern bank of the Euphrates, has become the administrative center of a territory spanning hundreds of miles. Grain barges arrive from the south, where the rich alluvial fields of former Larsa now feed Babylonian granaries. timber and stone, scarce on the flat Mesopotamian plain, flow down the Euphrates from territories once controlled by Mari. Tin and textiles move along trade routes that Hammurabi now taxes and protects. The palace complex expands to house the bureaucracy that empire demands, rooms filled with clay tablets recording harvests, labor conscription, canal maintenance, judicial appeals, and the endless correspondence between the king and his provincial governors. The administrative tablets reveal the machinery of control. Hammurabi does not replace local institutions wholesale. In conquered cities, existing temple economies continue to function, their priests maintaining the rituals and agricultural management that have sustained urban life for millennia. But above this local layer, Babylonian officials now oversee taxation, military levies, and the critical irrigation networks. Provincial governors answer directly to the king. Their letters, preserved in fragments across multiple archives, show a system built on personal loyalty and royal oversight rather than abstract institutional authority. The irrigation infrastructure receives particular attention. Water is power in southern Mesopotamia, and Hammurabi understands this with the precision of an engineer. Royal letters from this period detail his direct involvement in canal disputes between cities, the allocation of water rights during low-flow seasons, the conscription of labor gangs for dredging operations. A single blocked canal can mean famine for an entire district. The king who conquered by the sword governs by the waterway. Trade routes radiate outward from Babylon like the spokes of a wheel. Merchants operating under royal charter carry Babylonian textiles and agricultural surplus to exchange for copper from Dilmun, lapis lazuli from distant Afghanistan, cedar from the mountains of Lebanon. The standardization of weights and measures across the empire facilitates commerce, and the silver shekel serves as the primary medium of exchange. Market prices for barley, sesame oil, and wool are documented in tablets that reveal a functioning commercial economy regulated but not controlled by the palace. The streets of Babylon in these years hold the density of a capital city coming into its own. Residential quarters press against temple precincts. Scribal schools train the next generation of administrators in the cuneiform tradition, their practice tablets discarded in courtyards where they will survive for nearly 4,000 years. The Temple of Marduk, the Esagila, stands at the city's sacred heart, its treasury enriched by the spoils of conquest and the tribute of subject cities. Yet the architecture of this empire remains fundamentally personal. Every major decision flows through Hammurabi himself. Every provincial dispute of consequence reaches his attention. Every canal project of significance bears his authorization. The administrative tablets reveal no permanent bureaucratic hierarchy capable of functioning independently of the king's direct will. The empire runs on the energy, judgment, and attention of a single aging man, and the volume of correspondence suggests a ruler who sleeps little and delegates reluctantly. The strength that built this domain is also its deepest vulnerability, an empire shaped entirely by one intelligence, sustained entirely by one lifetime. The stele stands just over 7 feet tall, carved from a single block of black diorite so dense and fine-grained that it seems to absorb the lamplight of the chamber where it takes its final form. Diorite does not come from the alluvial plain. It is imported stone, hauled from distant quarries, chosen precisely because it resists erosion, resists time itself. A king who governs through personal will understands that the body fails, that clay crumbles, that even mud-brick walls dissolve in rain. But diorite endures, and upon this stone, in the final years of his reign, Hammurabi orders carved the most comprehensive collection of legal provisions the ancient world has yet produced. At the top of the stele, a relief scene rendered in shallow carving shows two figures. The seated god is Shamash, deity of the sun and of justice, rays rising from his shoulders, extending toward the standing king a rod and ring, symbols of divine authority and cosmic order. Hammurabi stands before him in a gesture of reverence, receiving not the laws themselves, but the right to pronounce them. The distinction matters. The prologue makes clear that the gods chose Hammurabi to bring justice to the land, to destroy the wicked and the evil, to prevent the strong from oppressing the weak. Below this image, columns of Akkadian cuneiform descend the stele in tight, elegant rows, 282 provisions governing nearly every dimension of old Babylonian life: property disputes and inheritance, marriage, divorce, and the rights of women to reclaim dowries, agricultural contracts specifying what happens when a tenant neglects an orchard, rates of pay for ox drivers, physicians, builders, penalties for assault calibrated precisely to the social standing of both victim and offender. The society revealed is stratified into three classes: the Awilam, the free citizen of full standing; the Mushkenum, a dependent or commoner of lesser rank; and the Wardum, the slave. Injury to an Awilam by an equal demands the famous principle of proportional retaliation: an eye for an eye, a bone for a bone. Injury to a Mushkenum or Wardum demands instead a fine, measured in silver. Hammurabi was not the first Mesopotamian king to codify law. Ur-Nammu of Ur had issued provisions nearly 3 centuries earlier, and Lipit Ishtar of Isin followed. But those earlier collections were narrower, less systematic. Hammurabi's code encompasses commercial fraud, military obligations, medical malpractice, and the liability of builders whose structures collapse. It addresses the rights of priestesses to manage property, the obligations of tavern keepers, the procedures for resolving accusations through oath and ordeal at the river. The epilogue speaks in Hammurabi's own voice, projected into the future. He declares that any wronged person may come before the stele, read the provisions, and find justice. He calls curses upon any future king who would alter or erase the words. The stone is not merely a record. It is a monument to the idea that law should be visible, permanent, accessible, carved where subjects can see it, enduring beyond the king who ordered it. Whether these provisions functioned as binding statutory law or as an idealized royal declaration of justice remains debated among scholars. Surviving court records from the period do not always cite the code directly. Yet the provisions are too specific, too rooted in the texture of daily commerce and domestic life to be mere abstraction. They reflect a king who has spent decades adjudicating disputes, managing canals, and governing a society whose complexity demands written standards. The stele stands in Babylon, in the temple precinct of Shamash, polished black stone amid mud brick and reed, bearing the weight of a civilization's attempt to replace the arbitrary with the systematic. The fingerprints of the sculptors have long since vanished from its surface. But the cuneiform remains sharp, each wedge pressed with deliberate precision into the stone, as though the scribes understood they were carving not just for their king's lifetime, but for millennia yet unwritten. Before Hammurabi's conquests reshaped the political map, before the stele was carved or the code proclaimed, there was Marduk. And Marduk's rise mirrors Babylon's own, a local deity elevated through deliberate theological labor into the supreme god of a unified Mesopotamia. This was not accident. It was policy, woven into every temple dedication, every ritual act, every royal inscription across 42 years of reign. In the earliest centuries of Babylon's existence, Marduk was merely the city god, one patron among dozens across the alluvial plain, subordinate in the traditional pantheon to Enlil of Nippur, Enki of Eridu, Anu of Uruk. The Sumerian theological hierarchy reflected political reality. Older cities held older gods held higher rank. But Hammurabi understood that empire required more than armies. It required a story, a divine narrative that made Babylonian supremacy not merely political, but cosmic. The prologue of the law code declares it openly. The great gods Anu and Enlil have named Marduk to supremacy over all peoples, have made Babylon preeminent among the world's cities, have established within it an everlasting kingship. This is theology as statecraft. By placing these words in the mouths of the older, traditionally superior gods, the scribes accomplished something revolutionary. They subordinated the entire existing divine order to Babylon's patron without directly denying any god's existence or power. The Esagila complex rises at the heart of the city, Marduk's earthly dwelling. Its mud-brick walls, plastered and whitewashed, enclose courtyards where priests perform daily rituals of feeding, clothing, and attending the cult statue. The god's image, adorned with gold and lapis lazuli, receives offerings of barley bread, dates, beer, and the fat of slaughtered sheep. Incense of cedar and juniper fills the inner sanctum. The king himself participates in major festivals, grasping the hand of Marduk's statue during the New Year ceremonies, an act that legitimizes his rule for another year. Hammurabi's year names record temple work with the same pride as military victories. He restores sanctuaries not only to Marduk, but to Shamash at Sippar, to Sin at to Ishtar and Adad across his realm. This is deliberate inclusivity. The conqueror honors local gods, binding provincial populations through their own sacred traditions, while maintaining Marduk's supremacy above all. The priesthoods become partners in imperial administration, their temple estates managing vast agricultural holdings, their scribal schools training the bureaucrats who run the provinces. The ziggurat rises in stepped stages above the flat plain, its summit shrine accessible only to priests performing the highest rituals. Whether this structure already bore the name Etemenanki in Hammurabi's time remains uncertain. Later kings would rebuild it grander, but the sacred mound already dominated Babylon's skyline, visible for miles across the irrigated fields. At dawn, its upper platform catches the first light, while the city below remains in shadow, a deliberate architectural theology, making the connection between heaven and earth physically manifest. The ritual calendar structures the year itself around divine time. Monthly offerings, seasonal festivals, the great New Year Akitu celebration lasting 11 days, these rhythms bind king, priest, merchant, and farmer into a shared sacred order. Hammurabi does not merely patronize religion. He inhabits it. His letters show him adjudicating disputes over temple property, managing priestly appointments, ensuring that offerings flow without interruption even during wartime. The gods must be fed. The rituals must continue. The cosmic order that justifies Babylonian rule depends upon their unbroken performance. This theological architecture proves more durable than the empire itself. Long after Hammurabi's territories fracture, long after his dynasty falls, Marduk remains supreme in the Mesopotamian pantheon. The Enuma Elish, the great creation epic composed perhaps a century or more after his death, enshrines Marduk's cosmic kingship in mythic narrative, the young god who slays Tiamat and fashions the world from her body. Whether Hammurabi's theologians composed an early version remains debated, but the elevation they began reaches its fullest expression in that text, and the trajectory is unmistakable. A city god became a world god because a king needed divine sanction for unprecedented political unity, and the priests of Esagila provided it in exchange for unprecedented patronage and power. The palace at Babylon is not a single building, but a sprawling complex of courtyards, archive rooms, audience halls, and domestic quarters. Its mud-brick walls plastered and whitewashed, its doorways sealed with reed matting or heavy wooden doors fitted with bronze pivots. Somewhere within this labyrinth, most mornings, the king sits. A scribe kneels nearby, stylus poised over a lump of wet clay the size of a man's palm. And Hammurabi dictates. What survives of these moments is astonishing in its granularity. Hundreds of letters bear his name or respond to his direct orders, and they reveal not a distant sovereign issuing broad decrees, but a ruler immersed in the smallest operational details of his kingdom. He writes to provincial governors about the depth of canal beds. He demands to know why a specific shipment of grain has not arrived. He intervenes in disputes between individual farmers over water rights, specifying which field should receive irrigation first and on which day. One letter instructs an official named Sin-Idinam to investigate a complaint about shepherds whose flocks have damaged a neighbor's barley crop. Another orders the transfer of exactly 60 laborers from one canal project to another. This is not delegation. This is a king who governs as if the entire empire were a single estate and he its sole competent manager. The letters reveal impatience with incompetence, sharp rebukes for officials who delay, and occasional flashes of dry displeasure when his instructions have been ignored or misunderstood. He expects reports, he expects them promptly, and he reads them. His involvement in judicial matters is equally direct. Petitioners appeal to the king personally, and he responds, sometimes remanding cases to local judges, sometimes rendering judgment himself. A letter survives in which he orders the investigation of a woman's property claim, instructing officials to examine witnesses and consult earlier tablet records before deciding. The bureaucratic infrastructure beneath him is real: judges, scribes, provincial administrators, temple officials. But the surviving correspondence suggests a man who trusts the system only so far as he can personally verify its outputs. The daily rhythm can be partially reconstructed. Temple obligations come first. The king performs morning offerings, likely at the Esagila complex, presenting food and libations before Marduk's cult statue. Administrative audiences follow, conducted in the palace courtyard where petitioners, officials, and messengers wait. Clay tablets are brought, read aloud, discussed. Decisions are dictated, sealed with the royal cylinder seal rolled across the wet clay. A tiny carved cylinder of hematite or lapis lazuli that leaves an impression of the king before a god, his name and titles framing the scene. His officials are known by name. Shamash-Hazir governs the Larsa region after its conquest and receives a relentless stream of royal correspondence. Luninurta handles judicial matters and is told in one surviving letter to bring specific individuals to Babylon for the king's personal review. The tone in these communications is that of a superior who knows every detail of the task he has assigned and will accept no excuses for failure. Yet the letters also reveal pragmatism, even flexibility. When circumstances on the ground contradict his orders, he adjusts. When local knowledge proves superior to central planning, he defers, grudgingly, but he defers. He is not rigid. He is relentless. Of the private man, almost nothing survives. No letter discusses his health, his family, his fears. The domestic quarters of the palace remain archaeologically elusive, Babylon's ancient levels lying beneath the modern water table, largely unexcavated. What the tablets preserve is the public mind, tireless, precise, suspicious of inefficiency, devoted to the functioning of a state that depends at every level on his personal attention. The fingerprints of scribes still mark the edges of these tablets, pressed into clay nearly 4,000 years ago. Somewhere beneath those impressions lies the voice of a king who believed that no canal was too small, no dispute too minor, no official too trusted to escape his scrutiny. The empire that took 30 years of patience and 5 years of war to assemble begins, in its final seasons, to show the strain of its own vastness. By roughly 1755, before the Common Era, Hammurabi rules from the Persian Gulf marshes to the Middle Euphrates, a territory bound together not by shared culture or ancient loyalty, but by the singular will of one man and the bureaucratic apparatus he has built around himself. The year names of his final regnal years tell a story subtly different from the triumphant declarations of the conquest period. They speak of canal maintenance, of wall repairs, of defensive works. The language of expansion has given way to the language of holding. Distant provinces strain against the center. The south, ancient Sumer, has never fully reconciled itself to Babylonian supremacy. Cities like Ur and Nippur carry memories older than Babylon itself, memories of their own imperial glory under the third dynasty of Ur, centuries before any Amorite chieftain pitched a tent on the Euphrates bank. Administrative tablets from this period reveal disputes over grain deliveries, complaints about garrison commanders, correspondence that carries the unmistakable tone of officials struggling to enforce directives from a capital that feels impossibly far away across the flat, shimmering plain. The problem is structural. Old Babylonian kingship is personal kingship. There is no professional civil service independent of the throne, no institutional continuity that survives the death or weakness of the ruler. Every canal dispute that reaches the palace, every judicial appeal, every military deployment requires the king's attention, because the system has been designed, by Hammurabi himself, to funnel authority upward. What made him effective as a young administrator now becomes a trap. The empire generates more decisions than any single mind can process, yet the architecture of governance permits no delegation without risk. Garrison posts along the northern frontier watch the horizon with increasing unease. The territories taken from Eshnunna require constant military presence. The destruction of Mari eliminated a buffer against the semi-nomadic peoples of the upper steppe, and now Babylonian soldiers stand exposed where once an ally's walls provided shelter. The irony is precise. The very completeness of Hammurabi's conquests has created vulnerabilities that a more modest kingdom never faced. Reports arrive on clay tablets carried by runners across days of flat terrain. A canal has silted near Larsa. A provincial governor requests additional troops. A temple complains that its traditional revenues have been redirected. Each tablet bears the impression of a reed stylus pressed into damp clay by hands working urgently, then dried in the Mesopotamian sun and dispatched northward to Babylon, where it joins hundreds of others awaiting the king's seal. The aging king, now past 60 if the conventional chronology holds, still dictates responses. His voice, filtered through scribes, remains sharp, specific, impatient with excuses. But the volume overwhelms. The system he perfected for a city-state groans under the weight of an empire. Provincial officials, sensing the limits of central oversight, begin making decisions without consultation. Some act loyally. Others test boundaries. No single revolt shatters the peace in these final years. The evidence suggests something more insidious, a slow loosening, a gradual fraying at the edges where Babylonian authority meets local resistance. The South remembers its independence. The North resents its garrisons. The empire holds because Hammurabi lives, because his name still carries the weight of 30 years of victories and the terrible example of Mari's ashes. But the clay is cracking. The fingerprints pressed into administrative tablets from these years belong to scribes working faster, handling more correspondence, managing a system approaching the limits of what mud-brick bureaucracy and human endurance can sustain. The last year names tell the story in their silence. For 4 decades, each year of Hammurabi's reign received a name commemorating its greatest achievement: a canal dug, a city conquered, a temple raised, a god honored. The final names grow quieter. The year he defeats Eshnunna, the year he builds the Great Wall. Then the records thin, the achievements narrow, and the king who once named years after the subjugation of entire kingdoms names them after the construction of a throne or the dedication of a single offering. The scale contracts. The world is shrinking around him. Lamplight flickers across the walls of the inner palace, casting long shadows over stacked tablets and rolled reed mats. The king is perhaps 60 years old, perhaps older. Age in this era is imprecise, measured less in counted years than in the visible weight of time on a body that has spent decades dictating, deciding, and holding together by sheer force of attention a realm that stretches beyond what any single mind should govern. The administrative letters from these final years still bear his authority, but some scholars detect a shift in tone, instructions repeated more urgently, as though compliance can no longer be assumed, as though the machinery requires more force to turn. Samsu-iluna stands in his father's shadow. The heir has been prepared in the manner of Amorite succession, trained in scribal arts, introduced to the rituals of Marduk, brought into the presence of officials and generals who will one day answer to him alone. But no preparation truly suffices for inheriting an empire built on one man's reputation. The provinces obey Hammurabi because they remember what happened to Rim-Sin, to Zimri-Lim, to the walls of Mari. They have no such memory of his son. The temples still receive their offerings. Barley and sesame oil flow into the storehouses of Esagila. Priests perform the daily rituals before Marduk's statue, anointing, clothing, feeding the god in the prescribed manner. The canal systems still function, though maintenance reports suggest growing strain, silting in the southern channels, disputes over water rights that once would have been settled instantly by royal decree now lingering unresolved for months. The infrastructure of empire demands constant renewal, and renewal demands a king whose attention never wavers. There is no record of Hammurabi's final illness, no tablet describing his last days. Death in ancient Babylon was understood as a departure to the netherworld, a dark and dusty realm beneath the earth, where all mortals descended regardless of their earthly glory. The king who had received the rod and ring of justice from Shamash himself would descend like any farmer or slave. His body would be treated with the rites appropriate to royalty, mourning, offerings, the invocation of his spirit, but no pyramid or grand tomb would mark his resting place. Babylon's kings were buried somewhere beneath or near the city, their graves now lost beneath millennia of accumulated settlement and the high water table of the Iraqi plain. Around 1750 before the Common Era, Hammurabi dies. The transition occurs. Samsu-Iluna takes the throne and immediately adopts the full titulary of Babylonian kingship. His first year names project confidence, military victories, construction projects, the language of a strong successor. But the confidence is performative. Within 2 years, the south erupts. Cities that submitted to the father refuse the son. The personal empire, held together by 4 decades of accumulated fear and respect, begins dissolving the moment the hand that built it goes still. The clay tablets continue to be pressed, the stylus marks still sharp, but the fingerprints now belong to different hands, working in a world where the lawgiver's voice no longer echoes through the corridors of power. Samsu-Iluna fights. That much the records make clear. His early year names speak of crushing rebellions, of victories over coalitions, of walls rebuilt and enemies scattered. He is not a weak king. He commands armies, leads campaigns, and for a time holds the core of his father's empire together through sheer military force. But the nature of the challenge has changed. Under Hammurabi, conquest flowed outward from Babylon like water through canals, steady, directed, controlled by a single intelligence. Under his son, the current reverses. Now the periphery pushes inward, and every campaign is defensive, every victory a recovery of something already lost. The south breaks first. Around 1742 before the Common Era, barely 8 years into Samsu-Iluna's reign, a figure named Illuma-Illum rises in the marshlands near the Persian Gulf and establishes what later chronicles call the Sealand dynasty. The Deep South, ancient Sumer, the land of Ur and Eridu and Lagash, cities whose traditions stretch back millennia before Babylon existed, slips permanently from Babylonian control. Samsu-Iluna responds with force, claiming victories, burning rebel cities. Archaeological evidence from Nippur and Ur confirms destruction layers datable to this period. But burning cities is not the same as holding them. The Sealand dynasty endures for over 2 centuries, an independent kingdom in the marshes that Babylon can neither reconquer nor ignore. The pattern repeats across the empire's edges. Eshnunna, absorbed by Hammurabi's campaigns, drifts beyond effective control. The Middle Euphrates territories, once governed through the infrastructure Hammurabi built after destroying Mari, become increasingly autonomous. The administrative machinery, the letters, the canal inspections, the judicial oversight, continues in the Babylonian heartland, but its reach contracts with each decade. Samsu-Iluna rules for 38 years, dying around 1712 before the Common Era. His son Abieshu succeeds him and spends much of his reign attempting to defeat the Sealand dynasty. One year name records his damming of the Tigris to cut off the southern rebels, a desperate, monumental act of hydraulic warfare that apparently fails. The dynasty continues. Amiditana, Amisaduqa, Samsuditana, names preserved in king lists, their reigns documented in year names that grow progressively more modest. Where Hammurabi's year names recorded the conquest of empires, his later descendants commemorate the dedication of a throne to a god, the construction of a modest canal, the fashioning of a cult statue. The ambition contracts to match the territory. By the reign of Samsuditana, the last king of the dynasty, Babylon controls little more than the city itself and its immediate hinterland, a kingdom roughly the size of what Hammurabi's grandfather had ruled. Then, around 1595 before the Common Era, the end comes from an entirely unexpected direction. Murzili I, king of the Hittites, leads an army from Anatolia, hundreds of miles to the northwest, across terrain no Babylonian strategist would have considered a primary threat axis. The Hittite force descends the Euphrates, reaches Babylon, and sacks the city. The raid is swift and devastating. The statue of Marduk is carried away. The dynasty of Sumuabum, which had endured for nearly 3 centuries, ceases to exist. The Hittites do not stay. They withdraw, leaving a power vacuum filled eventually by the Kassites, a people from the Zagros highlands who established their own dynasty over Babylon. The mud brick walls are rebuilt, the temples are restored, the scribal schools resume their work. And in those schools, students continue copying the laws of Hammurabi onto fresh clay tablets, not as living legislation, but as a literary and educational text, a model of Akkadian prose, a monument to a king whose empire vanished, but whose words remained legible. The throne rooms stand empty of his line. The canals he dug still carry water. The tablets his scribes pressed still bear the impressions of reed styluses held by hands dead for generations. The city endures. The dynasty does not. The code, carved in stone harder than any dynasty, outlasts them all. For more than 1,000 years after the dynasty falls, scribes in Babylonian and Assyrian schools continue copying the laws onto clay tablets. Not as statutes to be enforced in courts, the legal systems have moved on, adapted, fragmented, but as exercises in the mastery of Akkadian cuneiform, as models of royal prose, as monuments to an idea. Student copies survive from Nippur, from Sippar, from Nineveh's great library under Ashurbanipal in the 7th century before the Common Era. The hands are young, the signs sometimes clumsy, but the words remain Hammurabi's. His prologue, his epilogue, his careful enumeration of injuries and remedies, all preserved in the amber of pedagogical tradition, generation after generation, pressing wet clay with the same ancient formulas. Then, around 1150 years before the Common Era, the Elamite king Shutruk-Nahunta sweeps across the Mesopotamian plain in a campaign of conquest and plunder. His armies strip the temples and palaces of their treasures. Among the spoils carried east across the Zagros Mountains to the Elamite capital of Susa is the black diorite stele itself, 2¼ meters of polished stone, the relief of Hammurabi standing before Shamash, still sharp after 6 centuries of Babylonian sunlight. Shutruk-Nahunta partially erases several columns of text, intending to carve his own inscription over the ancient king's words. He never finishes. The stele is installed in Susa as a trophy, then gradually buried beneath the accumulating layers of centuries. Sand and rubble cover it. The city itself declines, is abandoned, is forgotten. 27 centuries pass. The stele lies beneath the earth of what is now southwestern Iran, in a mound the locals call the Citadel. In the winter of 1901 to 1902, a French archaeological expedition led by Jacques de Morgan excavates the Acropolis of ancient Susa. In December and January, workers uncover 3 large fragments of black diorite. Reassembled, they form the stele, nearly intact, the relief pristine, the cuneiform columns legible across most of their surface. The discovery electrifies the scholarly world. Within months, the Dominican father Jean-Vincent Schiele publishes a translation. The laws of Hammurabi enter modern consciousness for the first time since antiquity. The stele travels to Paris. It stands today in the Louvre in a room of Mesopotamian antiquities, behind glass lit from above. Visitors lean close to read the tiny wedge-shaped signs pressed into stone harder than marble. The relief at the top shows a king in a rounded cap, one hand raised in reverence, receiving the rod and ring of authority from a seated deity whose shoulders blaze with solar rays. Below, 49 columns of text enumerate the laws of a world vanished for millennia, yet recognizable. Property disputes, inheritance, medical malpractice, wages for ox drivers, the rights of women in divorce, the obligations of builders whose houses collapse. Hammurabi did not invent written law. Ur-Nammu preceded him by 3 centuries. But no earlier code survives with such completeness, such specificity, such ambition to encompass the full texture of a society. His stele became the symbol of an idea older than any single civilization, that justice can be written, made visible, made permanent, made available to anyone who can read the stone. Whether his laws were enforced literally or served as royal ideology remains debated. What is beyond debate is their endurance. Copied for a millennium, plundered as treasure, buried for 27 centuries, and resurrected into a world that recognized in those ancient columns the foundations of its own legal traditions. The king is dust. The empire dissolved before the pyramids were old. But the black stone speaks still in a language that took modern scholars decades to decipher, carrying the voice of a man who believed that justice, once carved, could outlast any throne. Thank you for joining this journey through the life and legacy of Hammurabi. If these stories of the ancient world have moved you, consider subscribing so you never miss the next chapter we bring to life.